what I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about like what are the problems inherent in a monolithic application, so a monolithic website. So let's say you build a website A, right? So and slowly but surely, new features keep getting added to it. We got a feature, right? So you add one feature today, you got another feature tomorrow, you got a third feature, you got a fourth feature, right? And you keep adding these, right? Slowly but surely, this website that started out this small, right? Here was the website originally. Give it a nice round barrier to it. So slowly but surely, this little website that we had here, this indicates the whole website, and we'll give it no fill. It starts out like that. Let's make this a little thicker so you can see it. Okay, it starts out benign and small like this, but all of a sudden, by the time you're done, it's this big, right? And there's no way to tell how big it's ultimately going to get, right? Because it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Now, what's wrong with this, right? What's the problem with it, right? So the fundamental problem is that over time you'll find, right, that your complexity is going to increase, right? So complexity goes up over time, and then in the same token, the value per the complexity, given the level of complexity, starts to go down, right? So on one side, the complexity is going up, on the other side, the value is going down. And also, of course, while all this is happening, the size of the application, right, is growing, 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 right? The application is getting larger and larger and larger, more features. The more features that are added to the application, the harder it is to basically manage the application, to maintain the application, to even if you wanted to modify the application, changes that happen here, right? So if something happens, let's say there's an error here, right? This error that happens here actually ends up affecting the whole site. The whole site becomes affected by the one error, right? So that's sort of like the fundamental issue with it. So, what's a cool way to build applications? Because what happens is that when you build your app, let's say you build your Blazor app. So, let's say this is written in Blazor in some form, because this is the example we're using. But really, it doesn't matter what technology you're using, right? This file is going to get larger and larger and larger, or the set of files used to manage it are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as they get bigger, again, you're not you start it starts becoming you start hitting a point where it's so much more complicated, than what you're looking for. You have to deal with style sheets being different, you name it. As you add more features and more capabilities, having it all bound together is difficult. So what people typically do is they change it a bit, right? And what we have in the networking cloud world is have this idea of a load balancer. And what a load balancer ultimately is supposed to do is behind it, you'll have your websites, right? So you may have one website, then you have another instance of the same website, you have a third instance, and they're all being managed and maintained through the load balancer. The load balancer is going in, and it is actually I'm just gonna use the regular arrows. Right? The load balancer is in here, and it's doing all its work. It's connecting to this guy. It's connecting to this other guy over here, right? And it's also connecting to this guy right here, right? So the load balancer distributes load between them, right? So this is basically how the load balancer works, right? Now, some load balancers get a little bit more sophisticated than that. This is the basic thing that they do, and this would happen on a low level port, usually called a layer 4 load balancer, because it just focuses on the networking and network packets. It really doesn't look at anything beyond that. So this would be a layer 4, right? Layer 4. Then you also have these layer 7 load balancers. That's another kind of load balancer that you can have, right? And this is layer 7 on the OSI model, which is a model for networking that you can go look up yourself. So the layer 7 load balancer, these are like more like the web application load balancer. Layer 7 is the application layer. So these guys understand HTTP. They understand all the language of the web and how computers interact with applications, right? So these layer 7 applications is what we're going to be sort of like looking at today. I'll put that in green. You can also use layer 4. I'm not saying you can't, but this particular lesson we'll be talking a little bit about these layer 7 load balancers, which is here. Okay, so now because they have more access to information about your website, you can do a couple cool things with them, right? So you can now start saying, okay, well, here's my load balancer. It's a layer 7 load balancer, right? And this load balancer or this appliance, I wouldn't even call it a load balancer anymore. I'll call it a layer 7 appliance as a whole, right? It's something on a network that does something, right? Now, because it receives traffic coming in, right, requesting a website, right? So let's say you're requesting .mysite.com. Okay. That's not showing very well there, so I'll just leave that out. So let's say you're okay, so here's a site that's being looked at. We're looking at, okay, move that out here. So let's say you're requesting this website right here. Now, because we now know what you're requesting and the paths that you're requesting, we can do some interesting things with this load balancer, right? We could, for example, add listeners to it, right? So we could add a listener, right, that listens for a certain name. So www.mysite.com. Right, so this is one of the things that this guy will listen for. And it might also listen to, for whatever else, right? Star, whatever, star.com, any site, right? .com, org, whatever, right? So these are the two things that this guy can sort of listen to, right? Now, it can be any number of things, but essentially on one side of it, you have this set of listeners, right, that receive messages coming from the web. When this web address comes in and says mysite.com, it'll go directly to this one. If another website matching some unique name, it'll go to the listener for that name, right? And then that listener then talks to a backend pool that's been configured for it, right? So you might have a set of rules here, right? And this guy will essentially check the rules, right? We'll do some kind of rule check, right? And based on the rule check, it'll determine, sorry, it'll determine whether or not this is something that it should be routing, right? And it'll determine where to route it, right? So then we'll move this over here. So the rules will basically tell it where to route. And then in here, you might have one listener that's going to website one listener that's going to website 2, and one listener that's going to website 3, right? So with this one appliance here, the whole thing, it will actually go in and based on the address that's been looked for, it'll apply rules and determine what server to connect it to. And these wouldn't be servers, these themselves would be, you know, these themselves would be, here we go, pools of servers, right? So in here, you could still have that load balance capability, right? So I can still have 2 versions of website 1 in here, and n number of versions of website 2 and number of versions of website 3 like that, right? You can make a determination of how big, small, whatever you want it to be, right? Okay, so let's do this one as well, like that, right? So now this is how it's set up. So this is where application gateway comes in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. In Azure, there's a product, right? The product that functions similar to this. Okay, so let's put this whole thing all in one. Oopsie. Here we go. There's a service that Azure provides, and this service, put this in green, is called Application Gateway. An application gateway from Azure does more or less what's been described right here. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go into the Azure portal. We're not going to do it with scripts. We're going to go into the Azure portal, and we're going to be creating a set of things, right? So, okay, so we're going to create a bunch of websites that are Blazor Web Assembly, right? Now you can do this with any technology. Now, each technology is going to be different. Um, uh, so keep that in mind. So in this case, we're going to create 3 websites, right? And then because they're just going to be basic Azure websites where, you know, one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to disable the forced HTTPS. And we'll talk a little bit about why, but it has to do with the fact that we're using a gateway, right? So when you're using a gateway and you want to expose HTTPS, you have to add a certificate. We don't have a certificate right now. Microsoft gives you a general certificate with app services. That's why they work. That's why everything goes under azurewebsites.net. But normally, if you just have an IP address, which is what we're going to have, then it won't work. So we're going to create a certificate. There's already an app gateway, so we won't create that. But we will then create those backends, right? So those are the backends that we talked about, right? And then after we create the backends, we're going to then create the rules. Well, first of all, we're going to create listeners, right? So it may be one, it may be multiple. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll create the rules. And the rules, of course, as you saw here, connect the listeners to the backend pools. And then after we create the rules, these rules, we'll go back and talk a little bit about how we're gonna do these rules. Then after that, we would then basically do any final mapping or rewrapping. Mapping. Okay, that's what we're gonna work on. Before we work on that, let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing here. So one way that you can set up listeners, right, is that you could set up listeners to use subdomains, right? So for example, this could be domain 1, right, .mysite.com, and this is domain2.mysite.com, right? And that's how you make the distinction. So if I come in as domain one, it'll take me this way. If I come in as domain two, it'll take me this way. And honestly, whatever domain name, as long as it maps to an IP address, a public IP address that resolves to this, right? And as long as you have a listener for it, right, it will work. So it doesn't even have to be domain one. It could even be, you know, or mysite.com. It can be test.com, right? That will also work, right? So any listener that resolves any domain name that resolves to the public IP that the gateway is using will be routed to the appropriate backend set of services as long as there's a front end listener that's listening for that domain. That's basically the way it works, right? So normally this is used to create subdomains within the same overarching domain. So basically, if this was my site, right, then then basically domain1.mysite.com would maybe take me to, to website one, domain two would take me to website two, and on and on and on like that, right? And you can kind of build your website that way and create that kind of structure. Certain sites work that way. Another thing you can do is you can use the same website. So we're going to keep it all as www, right? And we'll have this listener here that does that. And then here, you basically put paths. So in here, you say mysite.com/site1, right? Or mysite.com/one, mysite.com/site2. So now it's not going to be, it's not going to be by subdomain, it's going to be by path. So in this scenario, right, we're basically passing in different paths, right? And this is where it gets cool, because what you can then do now is that behind the scenes, you can break up your site into multiple smaller sites that are targeted and focused to the specific area within your overarching site that they are supposed to be focused to. So you no longer have this problem here, whereas new features and capabilities are added to your overall site, the overall site gets larger. In this approach, basically, you don't have one site, you create multiple sites, right? So this is one site, this is another site, this is a third site, and then you use this path-based routing up here to route it appropriately. So everything will hit this listener, right? So let's mark that as green. Then from that listener, it will go down here, mark that as green as well, to the application layer. It'll hit the rules, right? And then it'll end up basically going round robin between these two servers, right? That's the way it'll work, right? So this is the path that this will take when it's site one, right? And we'll also mark this as, oh, oops, can't do that down here. Also mark this as green, and then maybe we'll mark this as yellow. That's not gonna work. Let's try orange. Okay, so here we go. So this guy, this guy, if we also make it a www, then this guy will go the other route, right? This guy goes here, then it goes to application layer, then it goes here, and then it goes here. Okay. But then from the perspective of the user, they're still within the same domain, right? So they're still under, they've gone to mysite.com and everything is happening in mysite.com. And there's a rationale for going one way versus the other. And it really just depends on what your application needs are. That's what I think will ultimately drive it. But in this particular video, we will be showing you how to use the path-based routing with Blazor.